Hi, everyone. Welcome to the West Des Moines Public Library and the Iowa Files. I am so glad to see so many of you out here today on what a beautiful day. So our presentation is sponsored by members and donors of the West Des Moines Historical Society. There is a plastic box back there where you can put $50 bills, just saying. Or take an envelope, become a member. This is the kind of thing that our members and donors support. So we also get support from the West Des Moines Library Friends Foundation and the amazing library staff themselves, and Bravo Greater Des Moines. So this original program had to be canceled because Mother Nature hates us because we live in Iowa, but we are just so grateful to have Ruth back. So the first time I met her, she was talking about her grandfather, Ralph Hammett, and the Monuments Men. She was very clear to say he is not the one portrayed by George Clooney in the movie. But I still think it's a fantastic story nonetheless, and anything about preserving history and architecture and art is critically important. So thank you for joining us today, Ruth.
Thank you. So I want to start off, who has seen the movie The Monuments Men by George Clooney? Okay, that's pretty typical. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, some of the art directors out east in our larger cities, New York, Washington, D.C., grew very concerned that we were going to get bombed and we were going to lose our precious art. So they started writing letters to President Roosevelt, and he took that concern to Supreme Court Justice Roberts. And the Roberts Commission went into effect in 1943. One of the letters stated, "These monuments are not merely pretty things, not merely valued signs of man's creative power. They stand for man's struggle to relate himself to his past and to his God." And they also were pushing for helping out Western Europe during the war. But it did originally start with the concern for the United States. When the Allied troops crossed the Mediterranean and entered the southern part of Italy, near the Toe, they weren't running into much resistance. But when they got to this mountainous area in southern Italy, it was winter, and it was not going as smoothly. They did have a monuments man traveling with them who was reminding them that the Roberts Commission said, "We try not to destroy beautiful structures like this at any cost except the cost of life." Well, after weeks of heavy casualties, they felt that line was fading, and they went ahead and brought in the bombers. And you can see how Mount Cassino looked afterwards. Now, sadly, they discovered the Germans had never been inside like they thought. They were behind it. So the Germans had respected the building, and the Allies had not. Also, if you look at that lower right-hand picture, we had given the Germans a great advantage. That's a perfect place for snipers. So in the movie, George Clooney is portraying a man named George Stout, and he's talking to President Roosevelt and Supreme Court Justice Roberts and pleading that we put together this organization. But if you're following the timeline, the Roberts Commission was 1943. The bombing of the casino was April of 1944. MFAA was the title the original officers were given. Their job was to protect the masterpieces, fine arts, and archives of Western Europe and the eastern part of the United States. The nickname Monuments Men did not come about until Robert Etzel wrote his book in 2009. And I am very thankful that he came up with that nickname because it is far easier to say. So I'm going to go with that nickname. In his book, Etzel stated this was the first time an army fought a war on one hand and attempted to mitigate damage to the cultural treasures at the same time. So I'm going to introduce you to some of the key players of the Monuments Men. The original group was 9 Americans and 5 Brits. The man in the middle is your homegrown Iowa boy, George Stout, born in Winterset, Iowa. How many of you knew about George Stout in Winterset? Well, there's always a few who do. If you go shopping there, there's a few posters of the Monuments Men in some of the store windows. When he turned 18, our country was in World War I, and he enlisted in the Navy. When he returned, he attended the University of Iowa, and then eventually he ended up at Harvard. When he completed his studies there, they gave him a job at the Fogg Museum, and he is an art restorer, and some of the techniques that he created for art restoration are still used today. When World War II broke out, he became the person who came up with the colors for painting our Air Force planes. Sadly, the two men flanking him are the casualties of war. The one on the left, Fuehrer, is one of the Brits. He was trying to return treasures to a German church when somebody thought he was stealing them, and they killed him. That was less than a month before the war ended in Europe. On the right is Hutchhausen, nicknamed Hutch. He's a Minnesota boy, and he was killed by a sniper in Holland within days of the war ending. The man on the left is James Romer. He worked for the New York Metropolitan Art Museum when we joined World War II. His specialty is medieval art, and at that time he was the youngest art curator to ever be hired by the Met. So a very knowledgeable young man. He also had attended Harvard. And after his graduation from Harvard, he lived in Paris for about 3 years and worked at the Louvre. He was very fluent in French, despite the way the movie showed him. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, he went and studied German. So by the time he went over as a monuments man, he knew both French and German. On the right is Robert Posey. He was born in Alabama. He was raised in a farm family, and they could not afford to send him to college, so he joined ROTC to get his architecture degree. So he became a perfect candidate for the Monuments Men because he was both an architect and had military training. And he is the only one of the original Monuments Men who did not have a connection to Harvard. And then this is my Monuments Man, Captain Ralph Hammett. He is my maternal grandfather. He was born in Mankato, Minnesota, attended the University of Minnesota, and eventually ended up at Harvard, where he got to room with another Midwesterner, George Stout. So that's how they got connected. My grandfather was a strong academic student, and so when he completed his studies at Harvard, he was awarded the Rome Prize. That meant he got to live in Rome and study at the American Academy for 2 years, all expenses paid, room, board, food, everything. During his time, he traveled around Western Europe, took lots of photographs, and then he authored this book. Little did he know that less than 20 years later, he would be back in those countries, inspecting those same buildings for damage or trying to come up with ways to protect them during war. So what was happening to Europe's art and archives between 1930 and 1945? Well, they were in fine shape until Hitler came into power. He loved art, and he wanted art. So when he came into power, he took over some of the churches in Germany. If a church would not recognize the faith that he wanted them to, then their treasures were fair game. And then, of course, he was going after the art in Jewish homes. Then, as the Nazis conquered other countries, he continued to loot Jewish homes, churches, and museums. His Nazi art unit's name is right inside the circle, and this stamp was put on any piece of art that they confiscated. This photograph shows Hitler sitting in front of the model of his Fuehrer Museum. He had big plans for this museum to be built in his birthplace, Linz, Austria. On the campus was going to be other cultural buildings, libraries, theaters, opera houses. In the bunker where Hitler died, they found the blueprint to this museum, And so they have a lot of ideas of what it was going to be like. The blueprint showed a museum 3, almost 4 times larger than any museum existing in the world at that time. They also found 19 thick albums, and I mean thick, of the 35, and each page had a photograph that the Nazi art unit had taken. So Hitler was aware of what he had chosen for the Fuehrer Museum, and he could sit down and cuddle with them and feel comforted at night. So one area of the museum was to be called the Hall of Horrors. And he was going to fill that area with some art that he considered degenerate art. When that art was stolen, he had it all stored in one museum. It's like a storage room. So here's some examples of degenerate art. And once he made the selection of what was going in the Hall of Horrors, so when he conquered the world and won, we'd be able to go to this museum and see what monstrosities he saved us from experiencing. Any pieces he didn't select would be destroyed, and they were. What was degenerate art? It was art created by Jews, gays, or modern art. One piece was being chosen to be his centerpiece or of the museum, and that was the Ghent altarpiece. Germany had to return this to Belgium as part of the Treaty of Versailles, and he wanted it back. When the panels are put together, it's just a little over 12 feet tall and 15 feet across. When Hitler made his selection, the next people in line were some of his friends, and one of them was Hans Frank, the butcher of Poland. When Poland fell into the hands of the Nazis, he moved into the castle at Krakow, and after Hitler and another man made their art choice, he made his and filled that with his favorites. One of his favorites was this Da Vinci, Lady with Ermine. I want you to remember the Lady with Ermine and Hans Frank. I will refer to them near the end of my talk. The person who got to choose after Hitler, before Hans Frank, was his best friend, Hermann Göring. Whenever he selected art, he would have it sent to his hunting lodge. He was with Hitler every time Hitler made a selection. He was salivating and waiting his turn to be the next one to choose. They went together several times to Paris, but then eventually Hitler felt that he needed to stay put in Berlin, but Göring continued to go and make selections. When the war ended, they found 19 train cars filled with art that Göring had selected. It was hidden under brush on a train track that was not headed to his hunting lodge and not headed to one of Hitler's many hiding places. So, I'm still wondering, who was he hiding it from? Us or his best friend? Starting in August of 1939, Jacques Fuehrer, the director of the Paris museums, mainly the Louvre, was growing concerned. During the Spanish War, he had helped Madrid remove and hide their art pieces, so he knew what to do. He started with the most valuable pieces first, and as you can see on the right, he had them crated up. If they were one of the most valuable ones, he also put a special marking on them. He kept record of every place they were sent, and the ones with the markings, he sometimes would move from place to place and keep track of it. Where were these pieces going? He was sending them to chateaus on the western part of France and the southern part of France, far from the fighting. This photograph shows a German soldier guarding one of the chateaus. Now, this seems strange. What is he doing there? Well, Jacques Fuehrer decided to work with the Nazi art unit. And because of that, the Parisians saw him as a traitor. Hitler wanted to get his hands on it, and Fuehrer felt he was going to do everything he could. He was worried Hitler would get the art and take it across battlefields to get it to Germany. So he said, send your Nazi art unit to the chateaus and you can guard the art. Well, this freed up the Frenchmen to do other things, so that was a good plan. And then, but Jacques Jouard, those more valuable pieces, he never let them know exactly where those were. So he wasn't completely working with the Nazi art unit. Every piece did stay at the chateaus except for one. Hitler had to have the Ghent altarpiece. And on the right, I'm showing you what it looks like when you take these outside panels and close them. And I think it's just amazing. This is oil on canvas, and yet I feel like I can reach through that opening and touch that soft red garment. Mona Lisa was considered one of the more valuable pieces. Now, 20 years earlier, she would not have been considered valuable, but some of you may know the story of the Italian who stole her and wanted to get her back to her home country. So they did not want her to be taken again. So she did get the special marking. The map on the right shows the different locations where she was danced around to. Sometimes she was moved because Jacques Jouard was keeping her more secretive, her location more secretive, but other times it was because the temperature and the humidity in that chateau was not safe for her oils. One time when they were moving her, they put her in the back of a truck and sealed it so well to keep dirt from getting exposed, getting onto her oils, that when they got to the location, the person escorting her was found passed out. How do you hide winged victory? Created in 200 BC, stands over 19 feet and weighs over 2 tons. Well, this photograph shows that they are taking just the top part. So they've separated it here, and they're bringing it down some ramps to the main floor. That part was going to be put in a crate and sent to the chateaus. The lower part is considered part of the art also, but too heavy for a truck to manage. So that was taken down the same planks, and then they moved the planks down the basement stairs and moved it to the basement. They used pulleys to lower it onto its side, and then they filled bags with trash and covered the rock foundation with trash. When the Allies got into Paris and they went to investigate, it was still there under the trash. So it had always been under their nose. So this is the crate that took the top part of Winged Victory. And this is how the Louvre looked a few days before the Nazis arrived. Empty frames and empty galleries. And look at the bottom left photo. The last pieces of art were not getting the same respect. Time was running out. They were just putting them in the truck and putting several of them leaning up against each other and then heading down those dirty country roads. And the Nazis entered Paris in June of 1940. And here's Hitler and Göring on one of their trips to Paris, making their selections. And then one of the smaller museums was turned into the art collection area, where the art would be collected until it was selected and shipped off. And anything they didn't select, they would sell off to raise money for the troops. Okay, I'm going to give my voice a break. I'm going to let you read the next 2 slides. I'm going to take a sip of water. Hey, it was a great chance to take a sip of water. And these 3 paintings are from those 3 artists, and they were looted from French homes. So I am giving you some facts there. When the Nazi art unit took over all the art museums, they kept Jacques Jouard on staff because they felt he was cooperating. and then 3 women to do all the note-taking of where the art was going and what the art was. After a few weeks, they felt uncomfortable having so many on staff. They felt the more people who knew what they were doing, the more likely there might be an uprising. So they said, we need to fire 2 of the women and keep 1. So they looked at the 3, and they said, this one comes to work each morning. She's quiet. She doesn't say anything. And then she goes home. She'll probably be the perfect one. Wrong. Rose Ehler, portrayed by Kate Blanchett, had 2 art degrees, was fluent in German, and had an incredible memory. So she did do her work quietly each day. She was quiet enough that she could hear everything going on, and then we could go home and record what she had done or what she'd heard going on. The monuments men could not all travel together, so when they were being moved across the Atlantic, they were not considered critical cargo. Of course, the soldiers and equipment needed to get over there first, so they would just get on ships whenever there was space. So this photograph was taken by my grandfather, and the one on the left is George Stout. And in Etzel's book, he refers to him as the dapper George Stout, and I think it fits him well. And then to the right of him is Robert Posey, the Alabama farm boy. And then 4 in, leaning over the railing, that's James Romer. This photograph, also of my grandfather's, with his beautiful architectural handwriting across the bottom. Second from the right, dapper George Stout. Behind him, Fuehrer, the Brit who sadly died. And then my grandfather, as you can see, he's the shortest one in the group. I don't know why they stuck him in the back, but they did. A month after D-Day, they were finally able to start sending some of the monuments men across the English Channel. Again, they were not critical cargo, so they would send them whenever there was extra space. The first ones went around July 4th, and the last one got over there on August 2nd. When they arrived, they would look for a military unit to join, and they would travel with them and camp with them at night, mainly because the only thing they were issued for protection was a sidearm. They were also issued a camera and a notebook. So that was what they were pretty much traveling with. On August 13th, they were all there, so they met at a little French town. This is a page from my grandfather's notebook, and it's just saying the date of August 13th, who's there, and what their role is as a monuments man. A few days later, James Romer and another monuments man end up in Mont Saint-Michel, put up this sign that does no good. You idiot, this is the 20th century war. Who gives a damn about medieval walls? Well, don't say that to James Romer because he's a specialist in medieval history and art. So he had to remind this commanding officer that they both answered to Supreme General Eisenhower and the rules of war. The commanding officer's feelings were, for 2 months, our soldiers have seen nothing but death and destruction. Now they have found a town without any damage. They can go buy postcards, they can go buy drinks. Why should we just let them party? So they had to work on a happy medium. Ironically, a few hours after this conversation, James Romer was arrested by an MP. He saw this young man in a higher-ranking uniform and was convinced he was a spy. Thousands of these papers were printed, and as you can see, they were printed with the approval of General Eisenhower. And the monuments men carried hundreds of these with them, and they would go from town to town marking things to help preserve them. James Romer, because he spoke French so well, he would get to a small town and he would round up the kids between about 8 and 16, and he'd give them directions of where these signs need to be posted. Then he'd send them off, and then he'd start to walk around and make sure everything that he felt should be marked got marked, and he'd pull out his gum and chocolate and pay the kids. This is another page from my grandfather's notebook and a few of his photos. And if you have time afterwards, I have a book here of some of the photos of my grandfather's collection, some of the better ones. So you're welcome to come up and peek at those if you would like. Now, when I say Notre Dame, you think of that beautiful cathedral in Paris that suffered a fire about 10 years ago. But there's quite a few Notre Dames. And in fact, there's one in Chartres, which is south and west of Paris. When the Allied troops got there, they found the Germans had the town well occupied. In fact, if our troops had gotten there a day or two later, they might not have even been able to get to Chartres because they were preparing to blow them up. After days of fighting, they were starting to think that maybe the Germans were inside the church because some of the sniper firing. And they were thinking, okay, it's time to cross that line. It's time to bomb the church. Colonel Griffith did not want that to happen, so he volunteered to go in during the night and check out the cathedral. He did not find any Germans, so they spared it. And so if you ever go to France, you can still go visit the beautiful cathedral. It's stained glass windows and sculptures inside. And this is a photograph that Hausen had taken, and you can see in the foreground the destruction from when our Allies moved into Chartres, but there's a cathedral in the back still standing. The only damage it took was a few bullet holes and a couple stained glass windows broke. So, when James Roemer got to Paris, he went straight to his friend Jacques Jouart, who he had worked with, and asked, "Where's the art? What do you know?" Well, of course, Jouart only knew about the art that he had sent to the chateaus. He said, "I think there's somebody who knows about the art that's been taken from France." But she was not talking to him. She saw him as a traitor. And when James Roemer approached her, she kind of saw him with questionable eyes too. Because if you remember the way wars had been up until then, if you helped a country, you got rewarded by the country. So she really wanted to keep all of this a secret. He convinced her that the monument's men followed different rules, and she shared the notes that she had been keeping. In this book were over 60,000 art objects. Who here has ever been to the National Art Museum in Washington, D.C.? Okay, that only holds 4,000, so imagine 15 art museums. As Roemer looked through the book, he kept seeing one name show up over and over again, more often than others. So he gathered some troops and headed to the Neuschwanstein Castle, which most of us think is Cinderella's castle, but it's not. King Ludwig II built this castle after a broken engagement. He wanted nothing to do with people. If you want nothing to do with people, build a castle high in the German Alps, away from people. If you want to hide art from people, hide it in a castle in the Alps, far from people. Ludwig died before the castle was finished. The exterior was completed, but the interior was not, so it really had a lot of storage. The Nazi art unit had left behind their card catalog system. This was a great find. And James Roemer, who's checking off the art as it leaves the castle, his job was made a lot easier because there was about 21,000 stolen art objects inside that castle. So if you don't have the card catalog system, this would have taken longer than it already was going to take. One of the officers who was recruited to help wrote home, "The good name of the Army depended in great measure on the respect which it showed to the art heritage of the modern world." A lot of the art in the castle belonged to the Rothschild families. One family had lived in Vienna When Austria joined Germany, they were allowed to leave, but only with the clothes on their back. And everything in their beautiful palace was captured. Another one of the Rothschild families lived north of Paris, and their home was also filled with art. They ran a Paris hotel that was filled with art. It took from May to November of 45 to get all those pieces out of the castle. If you've seen the movie, you're going to recognize this. This is my favorite part of the movie. I'm going to call this scene a toothache. Robert Posey and Private Kirsten are in Germany doing their job when Posey gets a toothache, and he can't think about anything except that toothache. So he seeks out a dentist, and of course the dentist is curious because they look too old to be soldiers, and they're traveling as a pair of officers, so he inquires, and they inform him of the job of the monuments man. Well, he is just elated because his son-in-law went to Harvard for 2 years to study art, and then went on to Paris for 2 more years. And so he's like, he can help you. He can help you out. So he drags the 2 monuments men to his daughter and son-in-law's cottage. Now, I'm going to predict that the father-in-law and the son-in-law did not have a good relationship, because the father-in-law didn't know that he was an SS officer. And when it was discovered that he had this great art knowledge, he became the SS officer in charge of Goering's art. And so how did Goering pay him? With art. So they're sitting in his cottage with art on the wall. That shouldn't be there. So of course he was arrested, and intel was gathered. And so this map shows all the locations that were revealed where art was. Now, some of this they already knew because of Rose Villar's notes. So here is the castle. All the rest of those are mines. Because Hitler had studied art, he knew art was best if it's kept in the right humidity and temperature. Mines offer that. Also, mines are underground, so they're not going to get damaged as easily. I made the list again with just the titles, and notice 3 of them have an asterisk after them. These were close to the Russian front. The way we had agreed war is the Russians could come in those directions and we would come the other. Well, the monuments men knew Russia did not want to follow the rules that they were setting up. So they decided they needed to get to some of these mines before Russia did. So they gathered up a group to head to Merkers. They were shocked to just see art sitting around the mine, but just as shocked to find this back room filled with gold. Over 8,000 bars of gold bullion, 55 boxes of crated gold bullion, hundreds of bags of gold items from Jews, and don't just think jewelry. Remember, they also pulled their teeth to get gold. And gold and silver currency from many countries. You don't just conquer land, you also conquer economy if you want to win the world. And Eisenhower made his way to Merkers. Patton also did. I didn't get a photo from him, though, sorry. This piece of art was just sitting on a mine car leaning up against the wall. I think it looks far better in a museum. One of the other mines close to the Russian front was the Altis salt mine, high in the Alps of Austria. This mine was the closest mine to Linz, Austria. So every piece that Hitler had sent here was 100% guaranteed to end up at the Fuehrer Museum. This mine was an active mine for 1,000 years. It was still an active mine. When the Nazi art unit took it over, they pretty much told the miners that their jobs were done and that they would handle everything at the mine. So the miners were surprised when in that spring, they were told to carry in some crates marked marble, do not drop. Why are we getting to help now? But we couldn't help before. So they peeked. And they found 1,100 pounds of explosives. Hitler was putting out the narrow decree. If I can't have it, nobody can. Which means if these explosives go off, their livelihood is over. So they snuck in and replaced them all with palsy charges. When our monuments men and military showed up, the front of the mine was all filled in with rocks and debris from the palsy charges. But Robert Posey quickly figured out that this wasn't deep into the mine. And so the soldiers pulled away the rock, and sure enough, it was just in the front of the mine. And Posey found the Ghent altarpiece, and this is from his album where he documented some of the panels. George Stout in the back is helping to get the Bruges Madonna out of the mine. This was not the first time she was stolen. Napoleon stole her during his wars, and Hitler saw Napoleon as his hero, his role model. So if Napoleon had wanted it, of course he would want it. He had his Nazi art unit guarding it in Bruges. They simply just had mattresses around her in the church. As the Allied troops got closer, they were worried that their Fuehrer would not get to possess this precious item. So they laid her on a mattress, wrapped some sheets around her, and told a Red Cross truck that it was an injured German, and got her across the lines into Germany. And this is how that beautiful statue by Michelangelo looks. It just measures a little under 3 meters. Has anybody seen the Bruges Madonna? All right. Anybody seen the Ghent altarpiece? Okay. So after the war was over, they needed to get all the art back. So they're heading to the chateaus. My grandfather's there on the left. This photograph he took from either the 3rd or the 4th floor of that chateau. And when we first saw this photo, I was kind of baffled. What are all those little white things back there? Some of them are rectangular, some of them are not. Well, this is what they used to spell out. The Nazi art unit tried to find a place at every chateau to mark that Louvre art was there, so their pilots would not bomb it. See, Jacques Chouard was smart to cooperate. And here they're getting Goya's piece out. This painting belonged to the Rothschild family, the ones that lived north of Paris. After the war, they gifted it to the Louvre. It was their thank you for all that the Louvre had done to preserve the French culture and the French art. Private Harry Ettlinger was born to a Jewish family in Karlsruhe, Germany. His family had run a department store for over 100 years when it was boycotted in 1933. Harry had to wear the Jewish star, and he could not go to the public places like the library, the pool, the schools, the museums. In 1935, the Germans came in and boarded up the family's store, and they were starving. A few days after his bar mitzvah, they fled Germany, and they ended up in the United States. As soon as Harry turned 18, he enlisted. He wanted to help out his new country. He was with a troop that was being sent to the Battle of the Bulge to support the war. He didn't make it there because when they realized how fluent he was in German, they decided he needed to help with the Nuremberg trials. He eventually became the translator for Hitler's doctor, but the trial wasn't ready for him, and he sat around bored. That's not what he came over for. He wanted to help his new country. So he heard that the Monuments Men was grabbing any unneeded officers to help extract things from the mines. So Harry is on the right. He found a half-buried suitcase in this mine, opens it up, and finds a Rembrandt's portrait that hung in the museum in Karlsruhe. He'd never been allowed to see. I love full circle stories. In the movie, Raphael's portrait of a young man is seen burning. We do know that the Nazis started to destroy art because of the Nero decree. We don't know if this is one of them. Some people don't think it was destroyed. Here's why. Think back. Remember I told you to remember Hans Frank? When he had to flee Poland because the Russians were quickly getting there, he grabbed two of his favorite pieces, Lady with Ermine and the portrait. So why did the Lady with Ermine survive, but this one didn't? Also, someone signed a document in 1948 and swore that they had seen it in a location. But when the monuments men got there, it wasn't there. But they said, I saw it. So who knows? When the movie came out in 2014, this was valued at $100 million, so keep your eyes open. Also, the Monuments Men, it's now called the Monuments Men and Women Organization, put out a deck of cards. And each card shows one of the 52 things that are still missing. And it's not just 52 things missing, but these are the ones they chose for cards. So if you like to play cards or like to look for art, get yourself a deck. About 2.5 years ago, the World War II Museum in New Orleans opened up an area about the Monuments Men, and this is on the plaque when you enter. And approximately 3.5 million stolen cultural objects and works of art were taken and restored by the help of the Monuments Men. When the war ended, when VE Day happened, the original Monuments Men wanted to get back to their jobs, back to their civilian life. Most of the work that was happening was just removing things and documenting. That could be done by the locals who needed work. And the bookkeeping could be done by secretaries and librarians who had those jobs before the war. And that's why it's now called the Monuments Men and Women, because women did step in and help out. Now, all the Monuments Men headed home except for one. George Stout felt that if the war was still happening in the Pacific, then there was still work to be done. So he headed to the Pacific. When that was finally over, he headed back to Boston and back to the Fogg Museum, and he never spoke about his work. He was happy to be home with his wife and his family, back to the job he loved. So he really kept it quiet. The other Monuments Men, they came home and wrote articles, gave some guest lectures, and then eventually they kind of put it on the shelf too. But I like this quote by Private Kirsten about George Stout. He actually saved the art that everybody else talked about, because he really was a key figure in the story. George Clooney decided to end the movie by having the older George Stout, and that's played by George Clooney's dad, if you didn't know, going back to Bruges with, I don't know if it's a son or a grandson, and showing him the Bruges Madonna. Now, we know this didn't happen because we know how George Stout lived the rest of his life. But my family loves the ending of the movie because in 1969, my grandfather, Ralph Hammett, took my older brother, Ralph Hammett Allen, to Europe and told him his story. So it fits. And you're welcome to come up and look at the objects that I have up here. This is Rose Villar's story, which just got published in English for the first time a year ago, February. This is the one that the movie was based on. And the Monuments Man, James Rorimer's family, republished his notes and put it into a book form with photos, and they did that about 3 years ago. And if you're someone like me who loves to read historical fiction and wants it to be about the Monuments Men or the art, these two books fit that. And then about 10 years ago, the Monuments Men were honored with the Congressional Gold Medal. And that was quite a treat. I got to meet Robert Etzel and Private Harry Ettlinger, but none of them are alive anymore. I think the last Monuments Man or woman passed away about 3 years ago. So, all right. What?
I'm just going to turn on the lights.
Oh, got it. Okay. I wasn't sure if you were coming to grab the mic or if I should do something with it.
You actually just keep it.
Oh,
Does anybody
okay.
have any questions?
Oh, yeah, I'm happy to take questions if you have one. Or if you're overwhelmed, that's okay. I said a lot. Yes. No. When he took my brother over, I was 12 years old, and I was glad to see my brother gone. We were only 15 months apart in age. And my mom had just had a new baby, and so other things were occupying my life. So I did not know this story until my mother went to a lecture in Colorado Springs that Robert Etzel was giving, and my mom's sitting there going, he's talking about my dad. And so she pre-ordered a book for all of us kids and said, you need to know your grandfather's story. So, yeah. So my brother knew a lot, but he passed away 9.5 years ago. So the story, the last one holding the story is gone. So, yes. Among my grandfather's stuff, no, I have not. Do you have a Holland connection?
Amsterdam was preserved, and the Stasi, the East Germans, were all over Rotterdam, and they had to steal potatoes to survive, and his brothers, and not get caught. And they were rounding a corner near downtown Rotterdam, and they had a whole series of Dutch people lined up, and my husband's father was a leader in the resistance in Rotterdam. We have the letter from the Queen and the medal. And they had the people, and they were just shooting them one by one. They were lined up in a row.
That's where you were going with that.
That's what happened to my uncle in Italy. He was shot down, and when he was rescued, they saved some, but they shot others in a row. You either went left or right, or you got a bullet. And my husband, I just want to tell you that they came into their home. The Dutch homes are very little, and they were on the second floor. And boom, 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 the steps. My husband was 11, 12. He understood and knew what was going on. And they were looking for guns because they suspected that the father was a resistance
Part of the
leader.
resistance, yeah.
And they tore up floorboards in the living room, in the bedroom, and his mother had a big pot of water for bathing, etc., on the kitchen floor. They didn't touch the kitchen floor. The kitchen floor held all the long guns.
Oh, wow. Cool story. You need to do your own program. I had mentioned Hutzhausen.
Being shot by a sniper in Holland. Any of our soldiers who died there, the people have adopted those grave sites. They adopted them right when those men were buried, and generations have continued to take care of those. And Robert Etzel just published a book within this last year about that fact and the stories behind the Holland people and the soldiers buried there. So I don't have that book.
Any other questions?
To this day, they still honor Americans.
Yes, they do.
They do. So, thank you. Oh, yes.
Are there still art that hasn't been, that they
Oh, yes.
still be looking for?
Well, like I said, the 52 in the deck, and that's just 52 out of some of them. Yeah, there's still pieces out there.
Saying the title issues come up, who
Yeah.
paid legitimately for something that was stolen 5 generations.
Right. If you go to an art museum and it's a piece that was stolen during the war, they are required to put on the plaque that was stolen, where it was stolen from,
And where it was stored. So it does make it more interesting to go to art museums. Also, if you want to, you can get onto the Monuments Men and Women Foundation site. They put out a newsletter quarterly, and they always are talking about what's going on if they have found something. I referred to the 35 thick albums that Hitler had. One of them was just found last year. One of our soldiers passed away. The family went through his army trunk. He had been one of the soldiers that first arrived to Berlin, and he wanted proof that he was among Hitler's body, and he grabbed that album. And so, nobody knew he had it. So they're always keeping their eyes open, and I love when they report a story like that, and it gets returned to proper museums and such. So, all right. Thank you so much. I love telling the story.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much. So we round up this season of the Iowa Files on May 17th with the story of Villisca. Does anybody not know what happened in Villisca in 1912? All right. So Dr. Edgar Epperly has written dozens of articles, books, blogs, appeared even on Court TV, about the Villisca axe murders, and he'll be joined by filmmakers Kelly and Tammy Rundle, whose 2004 documentary explores the aftermath of this really heinous crime and the effect it still has today on a small town. Thank you again for coming, and thanks again to our members, donors, sponsors, the West Des Moines Library Friends Foundation, Bravo Greater Des Moines, and all of you. Have a good day.